Okay, get ready, because today we're going deep
Hmm.
into the world of Johann Gottlieb Fichte.
Oh, yeah, Fichte.
Now, some of you might be thinking, another 18th century German philosopher.
Right.
But trust me on this one. This isn't your typical boring academic.
No, not at all.
We are talking about a guy who went from weaving ribbons to, like, totally shaking up the philosophy world and, like, basically overnight.
Yeah, talk about a quick rise to fame.
Hey, the sources you've given me, they paint a picture of, well, of a mind that's, wrestling with some really, really huge questions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, what's so fascinating to me about Fichte is how he takes on this problem that's been bugging philosophers forever.
Uh-huh.
How can we be free when the world seems to run on these super predictable laws and causes, you know? It's like
Yeah.
he's trying to find this loophole in the whole system of the universe, one that actually lets us have, real agency.
A loophole for free will.
Yeah!
That's a high stakes game he's playing.
That's for sure.
But, looking at the sources here, Fichte's own life seems like a bit of a roller coaster ride itself.
Hmm.
It says here that he started out in a super religious family,
Right.
but later on faced these huge controversies over accusations of atheism. I mean, that's a pretty big change, isn't it?
It is a massive shift. And you really see this tension between following received wisdom and then this independent thinking
Right.
throughout his whole work. His family's piety couldn't even get him an education.
Oh, wow.
But luckily for him, this wealthy patron comes along and sees his potential.
Yeah.
It's like a philosophical Cinderella story, minus the glass slipper, of course.
Yeah, minus the
Yeah.
glass slipper. Okay, so he gets this incredible opportunity to study.
He does.
But then one of the sources mentions this struggle he had with something called intelligible fatalism. Now, if we're talking loopholes, this sounds like, well, the exact opposite, like total predetermination.
Yeah.
How did he even start to try and reconcile that idea with the idea of freedom?
Okay, so try to imagine feeling like every single choice you make has already been decided for you before you even know about it. That's essentially intelligible fatalism. It's like this. If we knew the exact position and the momentum of every single particle in the whole universe, you could predict the future, right? With total certainty.
Uh-huh.
So where's the room for free will in that kind of picture?
Oh, right. So it's like a cosmic domino effect. Everything is set in motion
Yep.
right from the very beginning.
Right, exactly.
And we're just along for the ride. No wonder Fichte found that troubling.
Yeah. And this is where another huge name comes in, Immanuel Kant.
Oh, okay.
Kant's philosophies, especially his critiques, offered Fichte a way to sort of, escape this deterministic dead end.
Okay.
Kant argued that while the world we see might work according to these deterministic laws, there's this whole other realm,
Right.
the noumenal realm, where freedom actually is possible.
Okay, so we're going beyond like everyday reality here.
We have to.
But how did Kant bridge the gap between these two realms?
Okay, so Kant proposed this idea that our minds actively structure how we experience the world. So we don't just sit back and passively take in information. We actually impose these categories like space and time and causality onto all the raw data coming in from our senses.
Right, right.
This means there's a part of us, the transcendental self, that's not trapped by these deterministic laws of the phenomenal world.
So there's a part of us that transcends the clockwork universe. That sounds a lot like the loophole Fichte was looking for.
You got it. Kant gave Fichte the tools to kind of, bring freedom and determinism together. And this encounter with Kant's philosophy, it wasn't just some quiet academic thing.
Right.
Fichte's first big work, the attempt at a critique of all revelation, was so brilliant
Yeah.
that people actually thought Kant himself had written it. Talk about making a splash.
That's a heck of an entrance. It's like showing up at a philosophy party and everyone thinking you're the guest of honor.
Yeah, exactly.
But from what I see in these sources, Fichte wasn't content just staying in the ivory tower. He got involved with the French Revolution.
Oh, yeah, he did.
He even earned the label of Jacobin.
Right, and this is where the ideas meet reality for Fichte. He saw the revolution as this real-world attempt to actually put the ideals of freedom and self-determination into practice. And, of course, this got him in some hot water.
So he was a philosopher of action then.
He was.
He wasn't just theorizing about freedom. He wanted to see it happen out in the streets. That's pretty different from the usual image of a stuffy academic.
You're telling me.
But even while he was involved in these, political debates, he was working hard on developing his own philosophical system.
Right.
which he called Wissenschaftslehre, or doctrine of scientific knowledge.
Yeah. And that's ambitious, to say the least. It seems like he was taking what he learned from Kant, dealing with criticisms from other philosophers like Maimon and Schulze, and then trying to build this huge, comprehensive system. But where did he even start with something so massive?
Right, that's a great question.
Well, Fichte realized that to really ground freedom, you can't start with the world out there and then, work your way back to the self. That's what he called dogmatism, and he thought it just led straight into that trap of determinism.
So if you begin with the idea that the material world is primary, then our minds are just a byproduct,
Right.
not a real source of freedom.
Exactly.
So-
So Fichte did something radical. He completely flipped the script.
Okay.
He starts with the I, the active, self-aware subject, and tries to demonstrate how our experience of the world actually comes from the activity of this I.
Hold on. Starting with the I.
Yeah.
That sounds a bit like solipsism, doesn't it?
Well,
The idea that only my mind is real, that could be a philosophical dead end too.
that's a fair point. And that's where this whole concept of self-positing comes in. Now, it's important to get this. When Fichte says I, he's not talking about you or me as individuals with our names and our, personalities and all that.
So it's not like, hi, I'm the I and this is my philosophy. It's something much more basic.
It's way more fundamental than that. The I for Fichte is pure activity. It's the act of becoming aware itself. He says the I posits itself, meaning it brings itself into being through the act of self-consciousness.
So it's not creating itself out of nothing. It's more like it becomes aware of itself in a way that makes its existence real.
Right.
But how does this self-positing lead to anything more than just the I?
Okay, well.
How do we get to the world that we all experience?
That's where things get really interesting. And we begin to see how Fichte avoids that solipsism trap.
Right, okay.
He argues that the I can only posit itself as free if it also posits a not I, something that limits and resists its total freedom.
So the I needs a bit of pushback.
Yeah.
Something to define itself against.
Yeah.
What did Fichte call this limiting factor?
He called it the anstos, which people often translate as check or impetus.
Right.
It's that moment when the I runs into something that isn't just a product of its own activity.
So it's like the I is bumping up against reality,
Yeah.
and that gives it this sense of its own boundaries and limitations.
Exactly. The anstos forces the I to differentiate itself from the not I.
Okay.
And that's where our whole experience of the world with all its laws and its objectivity actually begins to form.
Okay, I'm starting to see how Fichte's system fits together. We have the self-positing I, this run-in with the anstos, and this leads to, well, what exactly?
Yeah.
How does he build an entire philosophical system from these pretty abstract concepts?
Well, that is what we will be getting into in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to explore how Fichte's radical starting point leads to a truly fascinating and often surprising account of nature, morality, and even the nature of God.
Oh, can't wait for that.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Stick around.
Okay, so picking up right where we left off, let's see how Fichte takes this radical foundation, the I and the anstos, and builds an entire system out of it. And this is where it gets really, really interesting, because for Fichte, this isn't just some abstract theory. It has some pretty big implications for how we understand everything, from like the natural world to, our moral duties and all that.
So it's not just these heady concepts floating around out there.
No.
Fichte's really trying to connect this I stuff back to our everyday experience.
Absolutely. He wants it to be grounded. And one of the most surprising places this pops up is in his philosophy of nature.
Okay.
Now, you might think a philosopher who starts with the I is going to have this super idealistic view of nature, maybe even see it as just a projection of our own minds.
Right.
But Fichte is way more grounded than that.
More grounded. From what I'm seeing here, Fichte was really influenced by the scientific progress happening during his time, right?
Yeah.
He even named his system Wissenschaftslehre, which means doctrine of scientific knowledge.
Exactly. Unlike some of his buddies who were diving headfirst into that speculative nature philosophy, Fichte was more into understanding the basic structures of how we experience nature. Things like space and time and causality.
Right.
And how those are all shaped by the I.
So instead of trying to uncover some mystical force behind nature, he's more focused on how we perceive and understand it, like the nuts and bolts of it.
Exactly. He's not saying the natural world isn't real, but he's not taking it for granted either.
Yeah.
He wants to know how our minds through this I thing, play a role in building up our experience of nature.
So how does that even work? How does the I go from positing itself to, like, positing trees and mountains and all that stuff we see out there?
Well, remember the anstos? That bump into the not I, that kind of puts the brakes on the I's total freedom. Fichte says that encounter is what forces the I to come up with ideas like space, time, and causality to make sense of what it experiences.
So it's like the I is banging up against the world, and these concepts are the tools it needs to, like, navigate that world.
Exactly. These concepts, they don't just appear out of nowhere. They come about because the I is actively engaging with the not I. This back and forth, this like push and pull between the I and the world, that's how our understanding of nature starts to take shape.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's like we're not just sitting back and watching nature. We're building our understanding of it through this constant interaction with the world.
Exactly. And this brings us to another big piece of Fichte's system, ethics.
Okay.
If our very experience of the world comes from the I, then what does that mean for how we should act?
Right.
What does it mean to be moral in a world that we, partially build ourselves?
That's a huge question. It seems like Fichte's really upping the ante here. If we're not just puppets in some predetermined plan, if we're part of shaping our reality, that comes with some heavy responsibility.
Big time. And for Fichte, this responsibility goes right back to the I as this self-positing free agent.
Right.
He says the I has this built-in drive to actually realize its freedom, to act in the world according to its own goal.
So it's not just about thinking or perceiving.
No.
It's about acting in a way that expresses our freedom.
Yes.
But hold on, doesn't that lead to, like, a do whatever you want kind of morality?
Uh-huh.
If everyone is just chasing their own goals, wouldn't that be total chaos?
That's a good question and a common one. But Fichte has a more complex answer.
Okay.
He argues that true freedom isn't about just doing whatever you feel like. It's about acting in a way that lines up with reason. And for him, the best example of reason is the moral law.
So there are limits to our freedom. It's not about indulging every whim, but about acting according to some moral code. But how do we even know what that code is? Are they just handed down to us, like divine commandments or something?
That's where Fichte's idea of autonomy comes in. He hates any kind of moral system based on just blindly obeying some external authority.
Okay.
To be truly free, for Fichte, isn't about following rules from outside. It's about giving yourself the law, deciding your own principles based on reason.
Wait, so we're free to act, but we're also free to decide the rules.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of like a paradox.
That's a radical idea. But it's at the core of Fichte's ethics. He thinks that to be truly free, we also have to be moral. And to be truly moral, we have to be free to choose our own principles.
So it's like freedom and morality are two sides of the same coin. Can't have one without the other.
Exactly. And this idea of autonomy, of giving yourself the law, has huge implications, not just for our personal ethics, but for how we think about political systems and the role of the state.
Right, so we're going from personal morality to the big picture society. I'm really curious to see how Fichte takes these ideas into the political realm. He supported the French Revolution, so he must have had some strong opinions about how a free and just society should work.
Oh, he did. And this is where his concept of right becomes important. He makes this distinction between ethics and right. Ethics is about our duties to ourselves, how we act to reach our own moral perfection. But right is about how we relate to others, how we live together in a society without stepping on each other's freedom.
So ethics is like self-improvement, while right is more about social harmony.
That's a great way to put it. And that difference is super important for understanding Fichte's political ideas. He's not for some kind of selfish individualism where everyone is just out for themselves.
Right.
He's trying to show how individual freedom can work with the demands of living together with other free people.
But how does he make that work? How can you have all these self-positing eyes running around and still have any order or stability?
Yeah, that's where things get really cool. Fichte comes up with this incredibly original argument for why humans are social creatures. He says we can't even think of ourselves as individuals without recognizing other people and their freedom. Our ability to be self-aware, to be an I, depends on us recognizing other I's.
That's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying our individuality doesn't exist in a vacuum. It comes from how we interact with others, from recognizing each other as free beings.
Exactly. And this leads him to his theory of natural rights. He says we have these basic, undeniable rights, not because some king or government gives them to us, but because they're necessary for us to be free individuals in a society.
So rights aren't gifts from the state.
No.
They're essential for a free society to even exist.
Exactly, and this is what leads Fichte to describe the state's role in making sure these rights are protected. He sees the state as a way to guarantee that everyone can be free without interfering with each other's freedom.
So the state isn't some big bad force holding back our freedom.
Right.
It's actually necessary for us to be free in a social setting.
That's the radical idea Fichte is putting out there. He's saying that without the state, without laws and institutions to guide our interactions, our freedom would always be in danger. It's a philosophical justification for the rule of law, but based on this very unique idea of the I and how it relates to everything else.
Okay, this is all super thought-provoking, but there's one piece we haven't talked about yet. Fichte's philosophy of religion. Given all the controversy about his views, this seems like a really sensitive, maybe even explosive area.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Fichte's views on religion are complicated and often people get them wrong, but they're also really important for understanding his whole philosophy. And as you said, his own life, starting in a very religious family and then being accused of atheism, just makes it even more interesting.
It's like he embodies the tension he's wrestling with in his work.
Yeah, exactly.
So where do we even start with Fichte's God? Is it the traditional all-powerful being or something completely different?
That is the big question. And to figure that out, we need to circle back to that core idea of freedom. Remember, for Fichte, being truly free isn't about making random choices. It's about acting morally following reason.
Right. We talked about how he ties those two together, freedom and morality. You can't have one without the other.
Right.
But how does that connect to God?
Well, here's where Fichte does something pretty fascinating. He says that for our moral actions to actually matter, for them to have real meaning in the grand scheme of things, there needs to be some kind of moral order to the universe. And this moral order, that's what we call God.
So God isn't some being up there watching everything we do and judging us.
Right.
It's more like a principle, a guarantee that our efforts to be good aren't pointless.
Exactly. Fichte argues that we can't really prove this moral order exists in, like, a scientific way. But if we want our lives to have moral meaning, we have to believe it's there. It's not about certainty. It's about what we need to live a moral life.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Right.
It's like he's saying we believe in God because we need our moral choices to matter. But wasn't that what got him in hot water? What caused that whole atheism controversy?
Yeah, it definitely did. And the funny thing is, Fichte saw himself as giving people a stronger reason to believe in God. One that wasn't based on blind faith or some dogma.
So he wanted to base faith on reason, on how we experience morality. But some people weren't having it.
Many thought he was attacking religion. They said he was making God just a product of our minds, taking away all the mystery and authority.
It's like he was trying to bring religion into this new way of thinking where reason and individual freedom were becoming more important.
Yeah, you could say that. And back then, that was a radical idea. It even felt dangerous to some people who really clung to those traditional religious ideas.
So this controversy made Fichte rethink his ideas about religion.
Oh, yeah, definitely. In his later writings, he's dealing with these criticisms, trying to make his position clearer. Like in his book, The Vocation of Man, he digs into this connection between knowledge, faith, and the divine in a way that goes beyond just pure logic.
It's like he's saying there's more to experience than just what we can think about rationally.
Right.
Maybe there's more to God than our intellect can grasp.
Exactly. He even suggests there might be a kind of higher intuition, a mystical insight into the ultimate source of everything. It's like he's trying to reach for something beyond the limits of his own system.
So what are we left with then? Is Fichte a true believer, a secret atheist, or somewhere in between?
I think the important thing is to remember that Fichte isn't trying to define God perfectly. He's not giving us a list of rules to believe in. What he's doing is showing us that trying to live a moral life, striving for freedom and meaning, points us towards something bigger than ourselves.
It's like he's saying that needing a moral order, something that gives our actions weight and meaning, is built into who we are as humans.
Exactly. And whether we call that God or something else, Fichte would say this need, this desire for something more, is a fundamental part of the human experience.
This has been an incredible journey through Fichte's thought. We started with the question of freedom, and now we're here thinking about God and the meaning of our moral lives.
And the amazing thing is, for Fichte, These aren't just abstract philosophical problems. They're tied to how we live, how we build our societies, and how we understand our place in the universe.
So what do you think, listener? Where do you stand on these big questions Fichte's brought up? Does his idea of a moral order make sense to you as the basis of faith? Or do you see it as taking away from the idea of God?
We want you to keep exploring these ideas, to read Fichte's work and see where it takes you. Maybe you'll find, like Fichte, that the deepest truths aren't found in easy answers, but in that constant struggle to understand ourselves and the world.
Okay, so we've mapped out Fichte's whole system. We've looked at his ideas about freedom, nature, and even politics.
Yeah.
Now, for the big one, his philosophy of religion.
Right.
This is where it gets really tricky, right?
It's definitely the most debated and a lot of times misunderstood part of Fichte's thought.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, his own life, starting out super religious and then getting hit with accusations of atheism later on, just adds another layer to it all.
Yeah, it's like he's living out those same tensions that he's trying to work through in his philosophy.
Totally.
So where do we even begin with Fichte's God? I mean, is it the traditional, all-powerful being, or is it something totally different?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And to get Fichte's answer, we have to go back to that central idea of freedom. For him, real freedom isn't just about making choices randomly. It's about acting morally, doing what's right, based on reason.
Right. We talked about that, how he connects those two things,
Yeah.
freedom and morality. Like you can't have one without the other. But how does that link to God?
Okay, so here's where Fichte makes this really interesting move. He argues that for our moral actions to truly mean something, for them to actually matter in the big picture, there has to be some kind of moral order to the universe.
Okay.
And he says this moral order, that's what we're talking about when we say God.
So it's not like God is some kind of supernatural being watching us and keeping score.
No, not quite.
It's more like a principle, a way of making sure our efforts to be good actually count for something.
Exactly. Fichte says we can't actually prove that this moral order exists, like in a scientific way. But if we want our lives to have real meaning, we have to assume it's there. It's not about being totally sure. It's about what makes sense for us to live a moral life.
That's a bold claim. It's like he's saying we believe in God because we need our moral choices to matter. But wasn't that what got him into all that trouble? That whole atheism controversy.
Oh, absolutely. The funny thing is, Fichte thought he was giving people a much stronger reason to believe in God, a reason that wasn't based on just blind faith or some kind of dogma.
So he wanted to ground faith in reason in how we experience morality.
Right.
But it sounds like people weren't ready for that.
A lot of folks back then saw it as a direct attack on traditional religion. They thought he was making God just a product of the human mind, taking away all the mystery and authority.
It's like he was trying to update religion, make it fit into this new way of thinking where reason and individual freedom were super important.
Exactly. And in those days, that was a really radical, even dangerous idea for people who were holding on to those old religious beliefs.
So this whole controversy forced him to clarify his thinking about religion.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You can see him grappling with these criticisms, trying to explain himself better, especially in his later work, like in his book, The Vocation of Man.
Right.
He really digs into this connection between what we know, what we believe, and this idea of the divine. And he does it in a way that goes beyond just logic and reasoning.
So he's recognizing that there's more to experience than what we can figure out with our minds alone.
Exactly.
Maybe there's more to God than our intellect can grasp.
Yeah, he even hints at this idea of a higher intuition, some kind of mystical understanding of the ultimate ground of being. It's like he's reaching for something beyond the limits of his own system.
So where does that leave us? I mean, is Fichte a true believer, a secret atheist, or something in between?
I think the key is that Fichte isn't trying to put God into a neat little box,
Right.
He's not giving us a list of things to believe or not believe. Instead, he's showing us how the act of living a moral life, striving for freedom and meaning, points us towards something bigger than ourselves.
It's like he's saying that need for a moral order, for something that gives our actions weight and meaning, is built into us as human beings.
Exactly. And whether you call that God or something else, Fichte would say that need, that yearning for something more, is a fundamental part of being human.
This has been an incredible journey through Fichte's thought. We started with the question of freedom, and we ended up contemplating God and the meaning of our moral lives.
And what's amazing is that for Fichte, these aren't just abstract philosophical puzzles to solve. They're directly connected to how we live, how we build societies, and how we understand our place in the universe.
So, to our listeners, where do you stand on all of this? Does Fichte's idea of a moral order as the basis for faith resonate with you? Or do you see it as, diminishing the concept of God? We encourage you to keep thinking about these ideas, to dive deeper into Fichte's work and see where it takes you. Maybe, like Fichte, you'll find that the most important truths aren't in easy answers, but in the constant struggle to understand ourselves and the world around us.
And on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Johann Gottlieb Fichte.
See you next time.